After a series of lightning victories in the first half of 1942, the Empire of Japan believed it had reached the height of its power in the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor to Singapore, from the Java Sea to Rabaul, the rising sun flag fluttered proudly over vast stretches of conquered seas and islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, with 6 fleet carriers and hundreds of modern naval aircraft, was regarded as the most powerful maritime force in the world. However, after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first naval engagement fought entirely by aircraft without the opposing ships ever sighting each other, the Japanese began to realize that America's strength was far from broken. Though the carrier Yorktown was damaged, it survived, and the United States had demonstrated formidable organization, resilience, and fighting capacity. In response, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, conceived a new campaign designed to annihilate the remaining American carriers. His strategic goal was not only to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but also to expand Japan's defensive perimeter eastward, creating a buffer zone that would shield the empire from counterattacks. Yamamoto believed that by seizing Midway Island, a small atoll halfway between Hawaii and the Aleutians, he could compel the Americans to fight at a disadvantage. He reasoned that the U.S., unwilling to lose such a forward outpost, would inevitably dispatch its carriers to defend it. When that happened, Japan's combined fleet, superior in both numbers and experience, would be waiting to crush the enemy in a decisive battle. The plan was codenamed Operation MI. Yamamoto divided his forces to mislead the Americans. A diversionary group would attack the Aleutian Islands in the north to draw attention away, while the main strike force, 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Naguno, would launch the assault on Midway. Behind them followed Yamamoto's main fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers, ready to move in for the kill once the American carriers had been lured into combat. Yet the elaborate plan was compromised before it even began. For months, U.S. Navy codebreakers at Station Hypo in Honolulu under Commander Joseph Rochefort had been painstakingly deciphering Japan's top-secret JN-25 naval code. Combining mathematics, linguistics, and intuition, Rochefort's team gradually reconstructed hundreds of code groups and key phrases. By mid-May 1942, they intercepted messages indicating that Japan was preparing a major operation against a target designated AF. The only question was, what was AF? Theories abounded. Some thought it meant Johnston Island. Others suspected Midway. To confirm it, Rochefort devised a clever ruse. Midway would send an uncoded radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that the island was running short of drinking water. 2 days later, American intercept stations picked up a Japanese transmission noting that AF is short of water. The answer was clear. AF was Midway. When Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, received this intelligence, he realized that Japan was walking straight into its own trap. Armed with knowledge of the enemy's timetable and approach, he devised a daring counterplan. Though the U.S. Navy was severely outnumbered, fielding only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, Nimitz resolved to ambush the Japanese strike force before it could attack Midway. In the final days of May 1942, Nimitz ordered his carriers to slip out of Pearl Harbor and take up concealed positions northeast of Midway, hidden in the open ocean. Simultaneously, he reinforced the island with anti-aircraft batteries, B-17 bombers, PBY Catalina patrol planes, and Marine Corps fighters. His goal was to construct a perfect trap, to make the Japanese believe they were the hunters, when in fact they were the prey. On May 27, 1942, Japan's combined fleet departed from Hashijira Base. On board the carriers, the mood was triumphant. Pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor believed they were about to repeat their earlier success. Admiral Naguno, commanding the carrier strike force, had orders to destroy every target at Midway. He had no idea that across the Pacific, every movement of his fleet was already being tracked. Throughout the voyage, Nagumo enforced strict radio silence to avoid detection, but that same silence blinded him to the fact that his plans were compromised. His fleet advanced confidently across the sea, unaware that 3 American carriers lay waiting beyond the horizon. By June 3rd, American PBY patrol planes spotted the approaching Japanese task force. The report flashed to Midway. Many enemy ships sighted, 700 miles northwest. Immediately, the island went to full alert. B-17 bombers took off to conduct the first attack, which caused little damage, but it confirmed the enemy's exact location. Meanwhile, on board the Japanese carriers, all went according to plan. At dawn on June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike of 108 aircraft, mostly D-3A Val bombers and B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, against Midway. Air raid sirens wailed across the island as anti-aircraft guns roared and Marine Corps fighters scrambled to intercept. Despite fierce resistance, Japanese bombs tore through fuel depots, hangars, and runways. Yet Midway's defenses held, and its scouts remained operational. When reports arrived that the island had not been neutralized, Nagumo faced a crucial dilemma. He had to choose between launching a second strike on Midway or rearming for an attack on enemy ships, if any appeared. As no American carriers had yet been sighted, he decided to reload his reserve planes with torpedoes, preparing for naval combat after Midway was destroyed. That seemingly logical order proved fatal. The rearming process left the hangars crammed with fuel hoses, bombs, and torpedoes, a disaster waiting to happen. Then came a sudden message from a Japanese scout plane. Enemy ships sighted southeast. Nagumo hesitated. If he launched immediately, his planes would carry the wrong weapons. If he waited to rearm, he would lose precious time. He chose to wait. He did not know that only a few hundred miles away, 3 American carriers had already begun launching wave after wave of attack aircraft. They knew exactly where he was, and within hours, the trap at Midway would spring shut.
As the sun rose over the Pacific on the morning of June 4, 1942, the 2 most powerful naval forces in the world prepared to engage in a battle that would determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. On one side was the Japanese carrier strike force, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, escorted by heavy cruisers and destroyers. On the other side stood the much smaller American task force, 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admirals Raymond A. Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. Neither side could see the other. Each relied on fragmentary reports from reconnaissance aircraft to guess the enemy's position. But the critical difference was this. The Americans already knew where the Japanese would come from, while the Japanese still believed they were the hunters. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo ordered his first strike launched. From the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, waves of Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers lifted into the dawn sky, heading toward Midway. On the carrier decks below, technicians worked frantically, hoisting 250-kilogram bombs with cranes, refueling planes, loading ammunition. The sharp scent of gasoline and gunpowder filled the humid air. Everyone believed the day would bring another glorious victory. Even as the Japanese attack planes winged westward, similar orders echoed aboard the 3 American carriers to the east. On Enterprise and Hornet, Rear Admiral Spruance launched his full-strike complement: TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher followed soon after. In all, 216 American aircraft lifted off the decks and set course westward, toward where they believed the enemy to be. While the American squadrons began their long, uncertain search, the first battle of the day unfolded over Midway itself. Around 6:20 a.m., the Japanese strike descended upon the island. Bombs rained down, smashing fuel tanks, radar stations, and sections of the runway. American anti-aircraft batteries roared in reply, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Outdated F-2A Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats of the Marine Corps scrambled desperately, knowing survival was almost impossible. Many were shot down within minutes, but their resistance inflicted losses and disrupted the Japanese formation. When the bombardment ended, the Japanese believed they had crippled Midway. Yet the strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Tomonaga, radioed back to Akagi with a less optimistic report. The base remained operational, with fuel depots and radar stations still intact. He recommended a second strike to ensure destruction. That message placed Nagumo in a dilemma. Half of his strike force was returning and needed to land and refuel. The reserve planes on deck were armed with land attack bombs. According to the plan, these aircraft were to be rearmed with torpedoes if enemy ships were detected. But so far, his scouts had reported no sign of American vessels. Confident he still controlled the battle, Nagumo ordered all bombs replaced with torpedoes, a time-consuming and hazardous process. Below decks, crews began removing the heavy bombs, lowering them into storage to make room for torpedoes. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks as aviation gas was pumped for the next sortie. Within minutes, the carrier's interiors were filled with a volatile mix of fuel vapors, bombs, torpedoes, and shells, a floating powder keg. None aboard realized that this seemingly rational decision had turned all 4 carriers into potential infernos. Meanwhile, the American planes had been airborne for more than 90 minutes. The torpedo squadrons flew low, skimming just above the waves, while the dive bombers and fighters cruised at higher altitudes. Poor weather and navigational inexperience scattered many formations. Lieutenant Commander Stanhope Ring's bombing group from Hornet flew completely off course, never finding the enemy, and eventually forced to turn back in frustration. Others were more fortunate. Around 7:30 a.m., a PBY Catalina patrol plane from Midway sighted the main Japanese fleet and relayed its position to the American carriers. The message electrified Spruance and Fletcher. They realized the enemy was closer than expected. Orders went out immediately for all squadrons to adjust course toward the reported coordinates. At 8 a.m., as the first Japanese strike planes began returning to their carriers, a new report reached Nagumo. A scout plane had sighted multiple enemy ships, apparently including a carrier. The news stunned the command staff aboard Akagi. The plan to finish off Midway instantly became obsolete. But chaos reigned. Half of his air group was still in the air and low on fuel, the other half-armed and scattered across decks, cluttered with bombs and fuel hoses. Nagumo faced the hardest decision of his career. If he launched immediately, his reserve planes would carry the wrong weapons. If he waited to finish rearming, he would lose at least 45 minutes, enough time for the Americans to strike first. As he hesitated, the seconds bled away like drops of fate. That hesitation gave the Americans their chance. Around 9:20 a.m., the first torpedo squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown appeared on the horizon. Lacking coordination and fighter escort, they attacked anyway. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, went in first, skimming barely meters above the waves as Japanese Zero fighters pounced from above. Every plane was shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived to witness the rest of the battle. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown fared little better. Within an hour, 35 of 41 torpedo bombers had been destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Yet their sacrifice forced the Zeros down to sea level, leaving the skies above unguarded, just as fate was about to deliver the decisive blow. On the Japanese carriers, the hangars were still cluttered with torpedoes, bombs, and open fuel lines. Mechanics, drenched in sweat, worked feverishly under the tropical heat. No one imagined that a single spark or a single bomb could engulf the ships in fire. At that very moment, a group of Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, running low on fuel after hours of searching, spotted the Japanese fleet below. They were in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, just moments before history changed forever.
As the sun rose high over Midway, the skies north of the island were filled with smoke and shrapnel. The American torpedo squadrons, flying the outdated TBD Devastator and the newer TBF Avenger, began their approach from the sea under dire conditions. These planes were slow and obsolete by 1942 standards, barely reaching 330 kilometers per hour, with almost no armor protection. Yet they had to press on into the deadly circle of the Japanese fleet, where dozens of agile Zero fighters patrolled the air above the carriers. The first to strike was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the carrier Hornet, consisting of 15 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They flew without any fighter escort. Their accompanying Wildcats had gotten lost while searching for the enemy fleet. Trusting his instincts over conflicting orders, Waldron headed toward the direction he believed the Japanese were in. When the fleet appeared on the horizon, he dropped to sea level and led a head-on attack straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and Zero interceptors. Within minutes, VT-8 was annihilated. All 15 Devastators were shot down one after another, crashing into the sea. Only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay, who would later become the sole witness to recount the tragedy. Floating among the wreckage, he watched as the Japanese fleet sailed on, untouched by their desperate assault. Yet the sacrifice of Waldron and his men set in motion a chain of fateful events. Soon after, VT-6 from Enterprise and VT-3 from Yorktown launched their own attacks. They met the same fate. Nearly all were destroyed before reaching their targets. Out of 41 Devastators that took off that morning, only 6 returned. It was a near total loss. But that bloody price unknowingly created an opening. Every Japanese Zero had been pulled down to sea level to fight off the torpedo planes, leaving the skies above the fleet completely unguarded. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo still believed he held the upper hand. He postponed the second strike, assuming the American threat had passed, and ordered his crews to rearm the planes with fragmentation bombs for another attack on Midway Island. The decks were cluttered with open fuel drums, bombs, and torpedoes, while fueling hoses snaked across the decks.
The crews worked frantically in this powder keg, unaware that a storm of steel was descending from the sky. At that same moment, high above, at over 3,000 meters, 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers were searching for the Japanese fleet. After hours of flying through mist and clouds, their fuel was running dangerously low. It was only through the daring judgment of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Group, that they found their target. Spotting the Japanese destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin the main fleet after chasing a U.S. submarine, McCluskey correctly deduced that it was heading toward the carriers. He followed the wake, and moments later, the scene unfolded before him. 4 Japanese carriers lined up under the sun, completely exposed. McCluskey knew the moment of destiny had arrived. He ordered his squadrons to split, one to dive on Kaga, the other on Akagi. At almost the same time, Yorktown's group under Commander Max Leslie appeared from another direction and aimed for Soryu. From more than 4,000 meters up, the Dauntlesses plunged in near-simultaneous attacks with anti-aircraft bursts exploding around them. Below, Japanese deck crews were still handling bombs and fuel, unaware of the doom above. The first bombs struck Kaga amidships, igniting the fuel and ordnance on deck. Flames erupted and spread through the hangars. Another bomb tore through the bridge, killing most of the officers there. Akagi was hit by a single bomb, but it exploded directly among the armed planes, triggering a chain of devastating detonations. Soryu was struck by 3 bombs, burning from bow to stern. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were engulfed in flames, while the Dauntless pilots pulled out and climbed away, carrying with them America's first great victory since Pearl Harbor. What happened that morning was the result of both unflinching courage and a string of improbable coincidences. The torpedo squadrons had failed tactically, but succeeded strategically. They drew the Zeros down low, disorganized Japanese defenses, and left the fleet vulnerable to the high-altitude strike. Their sacrifice became the key that opened the door to victory. Historians would later call it the 11 minutes that changed the Pacific. On the burning ships, Japanese sailors fought desperately to save their vessels, but the effort was hopeless. Secondary explosions twisted the decks and melted the steel like lava. By noon, Nagumo was forced to order abandon ship. Thousands of men leapt into the sea as black smoke columns rose thousands of meters into the sky. The naval might that had once terrified Asia was wiped out in a single morning. From the American side, returning pilots were stunned. They realized they had just witnessed the turning point of the war, although none could have imagined how completely the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted within mere hours. Aboard the Enterprise, McCluskey and his comrades looked toward the horizon, where 3 towering plumes of smoke marked the death of Japan's imperial pride. Beneath the waves lay the spirits of hundreds of American torpedo pilots, men who had paved the way for victory they would never live to see.
After the 3 main carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu went up in flames, the skies northwest of Midway were shrouded in black smoke and firelight. The battle was not yet over, but in only 11 short minutes, from 10:20 to 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the fate of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific was sealed. In that brief span of time, the naval and air power that had terrified the world vanished with the loss of the very carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Aboard Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi quickly received the devastating news. A seasoned and resolute officer, he knew that unless he struck back immediately, the entire operation would collapse. Without hesitation, Yamaguchi ordered every remaining Val dive bomber and Zero fighter into the air to find and destroy the American carriers. To him, this was not merely a military order, but a matter of honor to uphold the pride of the Imperial Navy. Japanese scouts soon located the American task force. Around 1 p.m., Val dive bombers began their approach on Yorktown. Though badly damaged weeks earlier in the Coral Sea, Yorktown was back in action thanks to the discipline and skill of her crew. When radar detected the incoming strike, the ship's anti-aircraft defenses erupted. 5-inch guns, 40mm cannons, and 20mm machine guns firing in unison. Above, Wildcat fighters fought desperately to intercept, but the attackers were too many. The Japanese planes dived from over 3,000 meters, plunging almost vertically. 3 bombs struck Yorktown. 1 penetrated the flight deck and exploded near the boiler rooms, shaking the ship violently. A black plume rose hundreds of meters high as flames spread across the deck. Yet, through rapid and disciplined damage control, the crew extinguished the fires within 30 minutes, restarted the engines, and had aircraft taking off again soon after. It was a remarkable display of resilience and organization by the U.S. Navy. Meanwhile, the Japanese pilots returned to Hiryu, claiming a great victory. They believed they had sunk an American carrier. Acting on this report, Yamaguchi prepared a second strike, this time with Kate torpedo bombers. But by then, American reconnaissance had already located Hiryu. At 3:30 p.m., Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, now operating together, took off to finish the job. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped westward, the Dauntlesses approached the Japanese fleet from the north. Hiryu was in the midst of recovering aircraft from the previous strike, her decks cluttered with bombs, fuel hoses, and armed planes. When the American pilots spotted her silhouette, they knew this was their chance to end the battle. Leading the first group, Lieutenant Richard Best dove at a near 70-degree angle. His 500-pound bomb hit squarely amidships, exploding among refueling planes. 2 more bombs from his wingman struck the hull, destroying the aircraft elevators and setting the bridge ablaze. Within minutes, Hiryu was a blazing inferno, sending a vast column of smoke thousands of meters into the sky, the final Japanese carrier consumed by fire at Midway. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku refused to abandon ship. As flames engulfed the bridge, they stood together, saluted the departing crew, and ordered everyone else to leave. By 5:10 p.m., the fire had devoured the vessel from bow to stern. Hiryu drifted through the night, burning slowly, until a Japanese destroyer scuttled her with torpedoes the following morning. Yamaguchi's death became a lasting symbol of the samurai spirit of Japan's navy, loyalty unto death. As night fell, the Japanese fleet was reduced to cruisers and destroyers. Their carrier force was gone. The Americans, though badly battered, Yorktown would later be sunk by the Japanese submarine I-168 2 days afterward, had won a decisive strategic victory. For the first time since the war began, Japan had suffered a complete defeat at sea. In the aftermath, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors, including many of the veteran pilots who had fought at Pearl Harbor. The U.S., by contrast, lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, about 150 aircraft and a little over 300 men. But Japan's true loss was irreplaceable: its elite naval aviators. Training a carrier pilot in Japan took years. The U.S., with its industrial capacity, could replace pilots and planes within months. From this moment on, the balance of power in the Pacific began to tilt irreversibly towards the United States. The Battle of Midway held profound strategic meaning. It ended Japan's string of unbroken victories since 1941, shattered the illusion of an invincible defensive perimeter, and forced Japan's high command onto the defensive. After Midway, Japan would never again seize the initiative in the Pacific. In every subsequent campaign, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, its forces retreated under mounting losses and dwindling resources. For America, Midway was not only a tactical triumph, but also a psychological resurrection. After the shocks of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, Americans could finally believe that victory was possible. U.S. newspapers hailed Midway as the rebirth of the Navy, and Admiral Chester Nimitz was celebrated as the savior of the Pacific. From this turning point emerged the island-hopping strategy, advancing step by step towards Japan itself. For Japan, Midway became a wound that would never heal. Official reports downplayed the disaster, telling the public only that the operation had not succeeded as expected. But within the Navy's high command, the truth was clear: an era had ended. The once proud combined fleet of Yamato had lost its backbone. From then on, Japan's naval strategy could only cling to desperate defense, hoping to exhaust American manpower and industry, a hope doomed from the start. As the fires of Midway faded over the ocean, the 4 Japanese carriers sank to the Pacific floor, becoming the grave of thousands. Historians would later rank Midway among the most decisive naval battles of World War II, equal in importance to Stalingrad in Europe. In just 11 fateful minutes, the course of the Pacific War had changed forever, from a sea dominated by Japan to a highway for the American advance, leading to the victories at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and finally Okinawa. That night, on board Enterprise, American sailors looked out toward the horizon, where the faint red glow of distant fires still lingered. No one spoke, but all understood they had witnessed a turning point in history. And across the ocean, in the silent meeting rooms of Japan's naval ministry, the elder admirals realized at last the divine fortune of Yamato had abandoned them forever.
When the sun set over the waters of Midway on June 4, 1942, the sea still glowed red from fires that refused to die. Japanese rescue ships searched desperately for survivors amid burning oil and wreckage, but most of what they found were drifting bodies and fragments of once mighty vessels. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now nothing more than faint patches of flame on the vast Pacific horizon. Through that long night, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into their crippled hulks, ending one of the most tragic and heroic chapters in the history of naval warfare. The following morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the final report. He sat silently in the command room aboard his flagship Yamato, then the most powerful battleship in the world. His staff officers waited tensely for orders. Finally, Yamamoto spoke only a few words. "Withdraw the fleet. This battle has gone beyond our plan." His voice was low and hoarse, heavy with sorrow, an expression of defeat that those present would never forget.
For the first time in his distinguished career, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor was forced to acknowledge a total loss. Midway was more than a military defeat. It was a fatal blow to Japan's grand strategy. From late 1941 to mid-1942, Japanese leaders believed they could seize a vast defensive perimeter, stretching from the Kuril Islands to Indonesia, strong enough to exhaust the United States into seeking peace. Midway shattered that illusion completely. With the loss of 4 carriers and thousands of elite airmen, Japan also lost the strategic initiative, something it would never regain for the rest of the war. The veteran pilots who had carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor, masters of modern naval aviation, perished with their ships. Japan's naval air training program, slow and rigorous, could not replace them quickly. Meanwhile, America's immense industrial might had begun to turn the tide. New Essex-class carriers slid off the docks one after another, and pilot training expanded to an industrial scale. Within 2 years, the U.S. had over 100,000 fully trained aviators, while Japan struggled to field even a few dozen sorties each month. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, understood the full meaning of the victory. In his report to Washington, he wrote simply, "At Midway, we have reversed the balance of war. From now on, the enemy will no longer attack, but defend." And so it was. In the months that followed, Nimitz and his staff began to plan a counteroffensive, the Guadalcanal campaign in the Solomon Islands. That brutal struggle, lasting from August 1942 to early 1943, became a war of attrition, but the United States ultimately prevailed. From Guadalcanal onward, Japan's expansion ground to a halt. Every island they had captured, Torawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, turned into a bloody battlefield where American naval and air power steadily overwhelmed them through sheer industrial strength. The victory at Midway not only saved Hawaii and America's west coast from possible attack, but also opened the path for a relentless strategic counteroffensive across the Pacific. For Japan's high command, Midway became an inescapable nightmare. Yamamoto sought to conceal the full extent of the disaster from the public, fearing that the truth would shatter national morale. Official communiques spoke vaguely of some losses in the Central Pacific operation. But inside the Navy's upper ranks, everyone knew the reality. With 4 carriers sunk and hundreds of aviators dead, Japan's striking arm had been destroyed. Those who had witnessed Pearl Harbor now admitted bitterly, Midway is Japan's Pearl Harbor. Strategically, the defeat robbed Japan of its power to intimidate. No longer could it mount major offensives to push the Americans back. Ambitious plans to seize Fiji or attack Samoa were abandoned. The fleet shifted to a defensive stance, dispersing forces to guard a long chain of islands from Rabaul to Truk, making them vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. From mid-1943 onward, the U.S. adopted the island-hopping strategy, attacking only key strongholds and bypassing others, isolating garrisons that soon starved or fell silent. Psychologically, Midway was a deeper blow. For years, Japan's leaders had believed in a divine destiny, that their empire was favored by the gods, that victory was inevitable. Midway shattered that faith. Younger officers began to question the wisdom of the war, though none dared speak openly. Historians later called this the spiritual turning point, when Japan first realized that it could not win a war against an enemy with nearly unlimited resources. In America, news of Midway spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country hailed it as a just revenge for Pearl Harbor. Photos, maps, and stories of pilots like Wade McCluskey, Richard Best, and George Gay filled the front pages. The nation's morale surged. A country once divided and uncertain, now united under the rallying cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor, remember Midway." Congress quickly approved massive new naval budgets, expanding shipbuilding and fighter production on an unprecedented scale. From a historian's view, Midway stands as a timeless lesson in intelligence, organization, and courage. The Americans triumphed not merely because of radar or code breaking, but because they used information wisely, took bold risks, and fielded men willing to sacrifice everything, like the doomed torpedo squadron VT-8. Those seemingly hopeless attacks cleared the way for ultimate victory. Military scholars later compared Midway to a chess match where one false move collapses the entire game. In that match, Admiral Nagumo made the fatal mistake of hesitation, while Nimitz patiently waited for the decisive moment to strike. More than 80 years later, when deep-sea explorers discovered the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu lying only a few dozen miles apart on the ocean floor, it seemed as if the three carriers were still sailing together on their final voyage. Those haunting images renewed the sense of Midway's tragic grandeur, a battle where both sides fought with valor, yet only one seized the fleeting chance offered by fate. The Battle of Midway transformed the entire course of World War II in the Pacific. After it, America shifted from defense to offense, launching a 3-year campaign that ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945. Without the victory at Midway, that path might have been far longer, bloodier, or perhaps even impossible. In hindsight, Midway was not just a triumph of tactics or technology. It was a triumph of intellect, will, and courage. The 4 Japanese wrecks resting silently beneath the Pacific now stand as solemn monuments, reminding humanity that war is always a cruel game of chance and error. Yet within that cruelty, Midway still shines as a symbol of transformation. A moment when history changed in 11 short minutes, and the future of the Pacific was rewritten in fire, blood, and human resolve.